Hello, everyone. This is Mark from ACRL and Choice. We're getting ready to get started here. And before we do, I would just ask those of you out there to give us a quick note in the Q&A box to let us know that we're broadcasting, that you can hear us, that video is working and those sorts of things. So if you could just drop a quick note there in the Q&A box to let us know that things are working on your end. We'd really appreciate that. And before we get started, I'll do a real quick sound check with each of our speakers. So Angela, if you'd like to say a quick hello.
Hi, this is Angela Eggleston calling from Boston.
All right, and Christy, if you'd like to say a quick hello.
Hi everyone, this is Christy Gertzen. I'm dialing in from New York, so nice to be here with you all.
Excellent. All right, lots of indicators coming in through the Q&A. We appreciate the feedback. And with that, I think we will get started. So once again, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Using Past Research to Solve Today's Global Pandemic, The Power of Nature Archives, which is sponsored by Springer Nature. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I just point out a couple of features of the webinar software. As attendees, when you log in, please know that you are automatically muted and your cameras are disabled. So don't worry about generating noise or feedback or anything like that. We've got that taken care of. Also, when we start up the presentations, you should be able to follow along with the presentation material in the main area of the screen. And we are using the Q&A feature today. So if you have questions for either Angela or Christy, please drop those into that Q&A module. We'll take some time at the end to answer as many questions as we have time for. If we don't have time to get to your question, we apologize in advance, but we will get to, as I said, as many as we can. Also note that we are recording today's program and that everyone who registered should receive a quick follow-up email with a link to that archived version. And with that, we are ready to get started. So let me go ahead and pull up our presentation materials. All right, to kick things off today, we have Angela Eggleston, who is an editor at Nature. And I will she's going to be talking a bit about the editorial process at Nature and sort of how she got to where she is today and what goes into that. So thank you, Angela, for taking the time to present today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Mark. So welcome to everyone. I'm very grateful to be able to spend a bit of time with you today to explain sort of, my path as a scientist, both as a student and now in the scientific publishing world, which it's been quite a long journey, and I'm happy to share this information with you today. So I myself didn't even understand, how one became a scientific editor at the time that I was thinking about choosing this as a career path. So I thought that I would give just a brief insight into how I ended up in this position. So I did train as a scientist with a bachelor's, master's, and PhD in aspects of microbiology, molecular biology, and biochemistry. I did do a couple of postgraduate positions, basically finishing up PhD work at UC Davis. After that, I received a Burroughs Wellcome Fellowship and did a postdoc in England with the Imperial Cancer Research Fund. And I used the final part of my money from that fellowship to go to Children's Hospital here in Boston and pursue sort of a final year of training. My areas of expertise are the biochemistry of DNA repair and transposition. So basically what I handle now at Nature is focused on, a lot on nucleic acid metabolism and biochemistry and biophysical papers. In terms of my publishing experience, at the time that I was sort of finishing up my postdoc, I started to apply for positions in the editorial world. Now, there aren't that many positions that have professional editors. It's actually much larger now than when I started. But I was fortunate that the second job I applied for, which was at Nature Cell Biology, they hired me even though I had never even taken a cell biology course in my life. So as you could imagine, it was a very steep learning curve when I joined that journal. But, you know, I very quickly, you know, knew that this was, you know, the right career for me. I was the person in the lab that everybody always gave their papers to before they were submitted. And so this was my niche. I was at Nature Cell Biology for almost 2 years when I received an email from my 3 previous bosses saying that, you know, Cell Press is looking for an editor with your particular background in DNA repair. And so that's what brought me back to the States in 2001. And I was with Cell Press for 2 years, working on cell, molecular cell, and developmental cell. And in the summer of 2003, Nature decided to open an office in Boston, and they wanted to hire a new editor who would have a background in molecular biology. Nature obviously is a much broader journal than the Cell Press journals were. You had all the physical sciences, you had things like paleontology, and so that was really interesting to me. And so I applied for the position and got it, and have now been here just over 17 years. Currently, I am a team manager, which means that I have direct responsibility for some of the team members. So why do we have journals, and why specifically do I value being at Nature? Well, science, you know, journals develop because science itself doesn't exist in a vacuum. When you have results, they are of no use to anyone in terms of advancing science unless they are, you know, published to allow dissemination to other researchers and discussion. And back in the mid-1800s, it was a really fertile time in terms of scientific discovery. You had Mendel working on pea genetics. You had Charles Darwin working on The Origin of Species, which was published in 1859. And so 10 years later, in 1869, Nature published its first issue. And basically, this group of individuals had decided that, you know, they really needed somewhere to publish all these results that they were generating. And the mission statement has been updated to make it a little bit less sexist, for example, but currently what our mission statement is twofold. So first of all, we want to serve the scientists themselves, you know, to rapidly publish their most significant advances in any branch of science, and to provide a forum for researchers to discuss news about science and policy issues that they were encountering. The second part of the mission statement, which I think is equally, if not more important, is that Nature places a lot of emphasis on ensuring that these results are disseminated to the public. And so that's part of the reason why we have such a strong journalistic section at the front of the magazine, because we think for the broader society, it's really important for the public to understand sort of what is happening in science and the understanding of the natural world. Last year when we were having our 150th anniversary, we were challenged to come up with a new mission statement. And I think the best one is only 4 words long at the bottom there. So we think nature is about intriguing science done well. So that's what we're trying to achieve as editors, to publish that work. So from the very start, Nature had a commitment to scientific excellence. This is an example, the frontispiece of the second issue, in which the 124 sort of founding proponents of the journal were listed. And more than 60% of those were fellows of different societies, which just showed that, this was something that from the start was really supported by the creme de la creme of the scientific community. And it was not just British scientists, but those in the US and in Europe as well. One thing to note is that in that second issue already, there was an article discussing a series of lectures for ladies about science. And this, I think, is sort of an unappreciated aspect of sort of the progressive nature of the Victorian era. There actually was a lot of thought that went into sort of public dissemination of science, not just for men, but also for women. And so last year, as I mentioned, we celebrated our 150th anniversary, and this was the cover that we commissioned. And what it shows is basically sort of the interdisciplinarity of the journal. So each individual point is a publication, a Nature publication since 1900, of which there are 88,000 papers. They are color-coded based upon the area of science that they represent. And then lines connect 2 publications that are cited by another publication within the same paper. So basically, if you have a paper published in Science, for example, that highlighted 2 different Nature publications, those 2 publications are connected by a line. And so what this is indicating is sort of how different aspects, different areas of science can be cited in the same publication, showing that, we really have this very broad scope. And, we are not standing still. So in the past 10 to 15 years, we have continued to evolve in terms of sort of the areas that we are championing. For example, we started publishing clinical trials within the last 10 years or so. We have more of a focus on health science. Obviously, there are new fields coming up like artificial intelligence and deep learning and robotics. We are doing more in terms of economics and social science and pure mathematics. So, we always published some papers in these areas, but now we've actually gone out and hired additional editors who will be responsible for championing these fields. So now I'm just going to give you sort of a brief overview of the editorial structure of Nature. So we do have, as I said, sort of the journalistic and comment section of the journal, which is handled by different editorial staff. But in terms of primary research, sort of the team begins with the editor-in-chief of all of Nature. Then we have 2 editors-in-chief that are responsible for either physical sciences or biological sciences. And below them, we have team managers. And then finally, we have associate and senior editors. So all told, we have about 34 people in terms of the editorial structure that is involved in dealing with the primary research at the journal. And we're spread across Europe and the US, sort of from San Francisco to Boston, Washington, DC, New York, London, Berlin. But we do manage to get together on Tuesday mornings all together to discuss papers that might be appropriate for News and Views. So our editorial model is that all of the editors are full-time professionals who have PhDs and postdoctoral experience, which is really critical because you need to be able to justify the decisions that you're making with obviously senior principal investigators. And so, you really need to be able to be respected for the decisions that you're making. We do not have an academic editorial board, and we are not affiliated with any particular scientific societies or institutions or funding bodies. And that's sort of one clear distinction between us and Science's model, for example. So we firmly believe that this particular model allows us to make sort of independent and unbiased decisions. And it also requires that we as individual editors take responsibility for the decisions that we make. There is no buck passing to anyone else, it stops with us. However, we're completely cognizant of the fact that, we are highly dependent upon the researchers themselves. So if we don't do a good job, they're not going to submit their papers to us, and they won't help us with peer review. And so, there needs to be a really good relationship between the editorial staff at Nature and the scientific community more broadly. And that's something that we need to continually work at. Just looking at manuscripts that are submitted to biology, typically we receive about 120 to 180 new manuscripts a week. Although in this very exceptional year, this has increased by about 25%, and most of that is due to coronavirus papers themselves. Then, depending upon the field, the particular field, about 75 to 95% of papers are returned to authors without peer review. So this is the first stage of selection. So it's up to us as editors to decide whether the advance and the content is sufficient to look for that outside advice. Overall, once you go through rounds of peer review and revision, the acceptance rate is about 8%, which means, in each issue of Nature, you see approximately 10 to 12 biology papers published. So peer review is actually a relatively modern concept. So for a very long time, the editor of the journal was sort of the person who decided whether a paper would be published. And Science and the New England Journal of Medicine started employing peer review in the 1940s. So they were really at the vanguard. Nature itself didn't start using peer review until 1966, which is when John Maddox started as the editor-in-chief of Nature. But it wasn't commonly used at Nature until the 1970s. And this is just an interesting anecdote from John Maddox himself. He said, for papers like, The Structure of DNA by Watson and Crick, it couldn't have been peer reviewed because it was so obviously correct, and no one could keep their mouth shut basically if I sent it out to peer review. So things have changed a lot, and we still think that there is a role for peer review that is managed by an editorial staff within the publication world. So what are we looking for when we receive a manuscript? There are a number of different factors that go into our judgment. Not every paper is going to have all or even most of these, but these are the things that we're keeping in the back of our mind when we're looking at a manuscript. There are papers that are just holy grails. So, a long-standing question in the field that someone has finally cracked. We're looking for papers that have striking advances, something out of left field that, could never have been anticipated. Papers that have very definitive conclusions. So we want to make sure that, the experiments are rigorously controlled and that the authors have provided experiments that would rule out alternative explanations so that, the conclusions that can be made are very robust. We also like to see mechanistic insight. So the fact that, the results are not just, some kind of phenomenon, the basis of which you don't have any understanding. So we're looking for that. And in addition, most papers, we want to see some type of physiological relevance. So is this an artifact of what you're doing in vivo? you need to show us that probably it's also relevant to what happens in the organism as well. Many of our papers actually develop new techniques in order to answer the questions that they're working on. So that is something that sort of makes them superior. Also, we look for orthogonal support. So you're not using just one approach to answer a question, but you have a variety of approaches that all are converging on the same answer. And then finally, we like to see papers that are interdisciplinary, that aren't just going to be of interest to one particular field. So these are all the things that we're looking at when we're assessing a manuscript. So, we do publish papers, and obviously, everybody is focused on sort of what the latest findings are and what's happening right now. But there is a lot of value to actually what's already been published in the past. And so, for me, I've actually been around long enough to sort of see sort of this whole evolution. So when I was a graduate student, you used to have to go to the library and go to the big volumes of the Index Medicus with your keywords that you specifically wanted to look up, and it would give you a citation, and then you'd have to go to the stacks and find the volume of the journal, and then take it to the photocopier, and very long drawn out process. When I was a postdoc, that's when we started to get sort of, online access. So you had Entree and then PubMed sort of bringing to you sort of the fuller citation along with an abstract, and eventually, links directly to the publisher's website. These days, people are using all sorts of means in order to find the papers that they want to contribute to their own research. So they'll use Google Scholar, or just a simple Google search, or use web crawlers or e-alerts. But in the end, you still need access to the paper itself. And so, as you all manage for your particular institutions, site licensors are often the way that this is done. But as I said, Nature, really wants the public to see the research that's being published as well. And so something that is unique at Springer Nature that, I think is just really important in this respect is that we have a program called Share. It's been going on now for, I think, more than 5 years. And so many of the papers that are published by Springer Nature now have a share link. And so you can go online and go to this link associated with the paper. And using that link, you can see the paper. So you cannot save the paper and you cannot print the paper, but you can actually read the full paper. You can post that link anywhere. And anyone, regardless of whether or not they have institutional access, can see the work that is published. And I think that's just something that's really unique about us. So the value of archives, as I said before, science doesn't exist in a vacuum. So in order to generate a hypothesis, you need to have, some question that you want to answer, and that is informed by what you know from the literature. So there's this constant cycle of generating a hypothesis, performing the experimentation, and then publishing that information that will lead again to more hypothesis generation. And so, this is just the way science works. And, you absolutely need to have access to the work that's been published by others in order to inform your own research. Unfamiliarity with the literature can actually cause you to waste time and resources repeating things that have already been done. And at the same time, the literature is chock full of loose ends. So observations that at the time the paper was published, people didn't understand what they meant. And so with time and new technologies and new insights, people can understand better sort of what that observation meant. So there's a lot of value just hiding out in the literature, just waiting for somebody to tackle it. So archives are used at all levels of science. So researchers will use archives to help develop the hypotheses that they're trying to get funding for. Graduate students need to know the background information about the project they're going to be working on for their dissertation. College or even sometimes high school lecturers will direct students to the primary research as a complement to sort of the more digested material that's presented in the textbook. If you're working at a biotech or in pharma, those researchers are always looking for an angle in the literature that will either help them avoid replicating previous failures, because that is money, or looking for something that others have missed that might be exploited in some kind of way for a therapeutic. And we're aware of the public. For example, families who have a child who has some type of devastating disease. Families can become really involved in terms of wanting to know what the basis is for the disease that their child is afflicted by. So these are things that are provided by archives. As an example, very recent, of how archival material can be useful, earlier this year, I published a paper on just sort of a basic biochemistry of an RNA modification that caused silencing of other RNA's expression. So you don't need to know the details, but this work was done in worms. And at the time that the authors were sort of finalizing their submission and getting the paper ready for acceptance, sort of coronavirus was coming up, and it was all over the literature, all over the news. And they actually did some background reading and discovered sort of a paper published many years ago that suggested that actually the coronavirus, of which SARS-CoV-2 is one, might possibly use a similar mechanism in order to evade host defenses in humans. So this is, a completely serendipitous sort of, connection that the authors were able to make, and they were going to go back into the lab, apply for, permission to sort of break the barrier that they had at that time to do any work in the lab, to go back in, because now they were doing something that was coronavirus related. So that was something that was, just happened by, looking at the literature. And last night, I just sort of as an exercise, I went back to see whether a review that I published as a graduate student back in 1994 was still being cited. So this was a very comprehensive review in DNA repair, and has been highly cited. And I knew that because the journal had told us it was one of their most highly cited reviews. But what I found really interesting was that 26 years later, when there have been so many more recent reviews on DNA repair and so much additional biochemistry done in the field, that it still gets cited more than 20 times a year. So there still are nuggets of sort of insight that people are finding valuable to continue citing. And so, I think that is something that, shows that, you can never anticipate really how much value might be in a paper. Sometimes there's just, something waiting to be discovered. And so with that, I'll just finish my presentation. Thank you again for joining us today, and I'll be willing to answer questions at the end of the webinar. Mark, you are muted.
Apologies there. One moment. All right. And so with that, we will transition over to Christy for a quick look at Nature Archive. All right. So over to you, Christy.
Hi, thanks, Mark. Thanks for your presentation, Angela. I hope everyone can hear me okay. So I just want to run through from our product portfolio for the librarians that are joining us today, a little bit more kind of a deeper dive into the Nature Archives from the examples that Angela just presented. As Angela mentioned, the Nature launched in 1869 and has published many of the most significant and influential papers in modern science. Specifically to the current state of the global pandemic, the Nature Archives is playing an important role in the contemporary research around RNA and also COVID-19 that we're seeing. In the following slides, I hope to offer a brief insight to Nature's strong legacy in this important area of science. And my slides are stuck. Mark, okay, here we are. Sorry for that. First, we have here some context around the how the Nature Archives may be used by library patrons. I know Angela went into some specific examples, but for those of you that might be tuning in now, the archives are not only used to cite previous research, the archives are used in grant applications, as teaching tools across academic levels, and as methods and protocols of how to, and in aiding students and researchers in developing essays and research papers. For librarians, the Nature Archives is available in 4 collections. The first Nature Archive collection offers a rich variety of material from original research and scientific news to reports of scientific society meetings. The first RNA paper was published in 1881. Up until 1949, a further 700 papers based in RNA research were published by Nature. These findings went on to form the basis for contemporary research. In the lower half of this slide, you can see the amount of citations these papers had from Nature and then from the rest of the publishing industry during this time period. The second Nature Archive collection spans 1950 to 1986. These post-war years saw a rapid increase in scientific discovery, particularly the biological sciences. You'll also note the amount of papers around RNAH. Again, we see Nature's strong position in the market compared to other publishers concerning citations data. The third Nature Archive spans 1987 to 1996. This period includes established scientific findings, such as remarkable advances in drug development and in improving the human health span. As the publishing industry grows, we can see a slight dip in the citations for Nature papers, but that's only by a slight 2%. And the final Nature Archive collection is home to some of the most groundbreaking RNA research and discoveries of the previous decade. In this slide, you can see an increase in the overall citations data to the Nature Archive. And with that, I will conclude just an overview of our Nature Archives 4 collections available for license to libraries. And I think we can move things over to the Q&A session. I just want to remind anyone, if they have any questions, they can use the chat box in the right-hand side if they have any specific questions for the great presentation that Angela presented, or if you had any specific questions about the licensing options for Nature or Nature Archives.
Excellent. Yeah. So as Christy just said, I would encourage folks, if you've got questions for Angela, please feel free to go ahead and drop those right in the Q&A module there. We do have some time. One thing that that I sort of am interested in, maybe hearing you talk a little bit about, Angela, is how does the Nature editorial team ensure the integrity of the research that comes out in Nature? Could you talk a little bit about that, and how and the sort of protocols or safeguards in even a little more detail than you did earlier?
Sure. So obviously, integrity is extremely important to us. And so over the past couple of years, actually probably not just under a decade now, we've started doing specific things to try and ensure that the research we publish is correct, and to avoid sort of fraudulent behavior. So one of the things that we have done is to institute a variety of checklists that authors are required to provide when they submit the paper. So these checklists cover things like material sources, ethical considerations, statistical analyses, other types of experimental approaches that are known to have sort of inherent issues. So for example, I know that on the physical sciences side, fuel cells, there are certain details that must be provided in order for a reviewer to know that the work is sound. So basically we have sort of more general checklists, and then we have sort of some topic specific checklists if a paper includes that type of data. And basically just trying to make the authors aware of what they need to do to make sure their data is robust, and then also for the reviewers to be able to see that the authors have said that their statistical analysis of this particular experiment can be found on this particular page, so that they understand sort of where to look for that information. Excuse me. In addition, we've asked authors to provide raw data, or we're strongly encouraging authors of the papers that we publish to submit all of their raw data to some kind of public repository. So this has been done, for a very long time for structural data or genomic data. But now there are other types of data that, basically, if you can generate a data set, we would like to ensure that it is in a repository that is going to be freely accessible to the public, and that will be around for quite a while. We also have a number of channels for people to let the editorial staff know if they think that there's a problem with one of our papers. So they can bring it to our attention, and the editorial staff will investigate these questions. And there are a number of different outcomes that can happen. So we can ask the authors themselves to issue a correction of something if it's relatively minor. We have a process known as matters arising, where someone brings us a question and says that they think part of, a central part of the paper is incorrect. They have usually have other data of their own to show that it is incorrect in their view. And then we will ask the authors for a response and send that out to peer review. And if the peer reviewers feel that, this is sort of a discussion and debate that does need to be published, we will go ahead and publish that, comment and reply online. Or, if things are very serious, we can ask the authors to write a retraction.
Excellent. Yeah, that's very interesting. It's always, there are comments coming in through the Q&A that I think I would echo, that it's always interesting to see a little bit behind the curtain at some of these journals, especially one like Nature.
I would say that, sometimes the investigations of these matters, that people bring to us after post-publication, it does take a long time for us to address sometimes, because there can be institutional investigations going on, and so people are like, why are you sitting on this? It's like, well, we actually are waiting on somebody else. So we do want to correct the record, if it's wrong, but sometimes our hands are tied.
Yeah, and yeah, absolutely. The corrections can be sticky business for sure. So we've got a question here that came in from Brenda, and I think this may be a question really for Christy, or if you know it off the top of your head, Angela, would be interesting to hear. Brenda simply asks, if one wants to search the archives, is there a link that you can follow to go out and take a look at some of these archives, or is that something that the Nature staff, would look through? How do people get access to the archives?
I'll leave that to Christy.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I'm actually not clear if they were referencing your the feature that you were talking about, Angela, with the sharing ability. So I'm not quite sure if they're asking the question to you or to myself, but the archives are available on nature.com, and you can search there openly. Obviously, if it's unlicensed content, users would kind of hit the paywall, but you can certainly search in the archives there. Yeah, if that's useful.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we talked a lot about sort of RNA research. Can you, Christy, maybe outline some of the other content or other sorts of collections that are available through Nature?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. The research that we've published through the years goes deep and has been very influential within science, and has become rooted in some pop culture also. For example, in the collection, the Nature Archives collection one that we have is actually published Einstein's theory of relativity. Another example in collection 2, there's the original paper on Watson and Crick's deciphering the structure of DNA, which is quite interesting. And collection 3 includes the first discovery of a planet outside of our solar system. In collection 4, cloning
and I
and
would
the
say,
birth.
sorry, and I would say in collection,
go ahead.
You have the paper that won the Nobel Prize for RNA interference. So you have the initial Fire and Mello paper.
Yes. Great, thanks, Angela. And in collection 4, we have the cloning and the birth of Dolly the sheep is revealed. So I think most people on an international level are aware of who Dolly the sheep is. So quite interesting. It's important to remember the access to the original research is important to library patrons. Often a citation of a citation or an abstraction from secondary literature can fall short or what the researcher needs. Archives enable them to establish the origins of their line of research, underpinning everything they do. So it's seen as pretty valuable in that sense. And specifically, some of the examples that Angela and I just provided about significant published research and research discoveries.
Actually, could I make one more point as well? Something that can happen is that people will read a paper and see in a reference list another paper that looks like it's relevant to their work, and will cite that paper without actually reading it. And it's important that researchers actually go to that primary study, regardless of how old it is, because it can be miscited. So, the paper that you're reading may have gotten sort of the implication wrong, which you won't know unless you read the original paper. And so that's why really, you shouldn't just use a citation because you think it's relevant. You should use a citation because you've read it and you know that it's relevant.
Yeah, a very good point. So we have a question here from Deirdre, who asks, and I think this should probably go to Christy as well. So for libraries, are the archives available to purchase by year groups, or is it the entire archive? Can you talk about the price points, or is that based on FTE? And is it full text of access to all the papers in the archives?
Yeah, great question, Deirdre. Yes, so in the 4 collections that I mentioned, the kind of year sets, as you might want to say, so they're available by the, so for instance, like you could license 1 of the 4 collections, you could do 2 of the 4, depending upon kind of what years you were looking at, or you can purchase the full Nature archives, the entire back file, as you might say. So yes, and as Mark mentioned, as far as like price points, I can definitely follow up with you offline from the webinar, because yes, pricing, as Mark mentioned, is based on the number of FTEs for the institution. So it does vary. There's kind of a ranges for the size of the institution and the number of users. So that's certainly information that we can follow up with you. And yes, as far as full text and data mining is available. So I'll be sure to get in touch with you about that.
Great. Yeah. So the data mining, there is a way for folks to do that. Great. Cool. Looking through, I would just encourage folks, if you do have questions, we've got plenty of time for them. So go ahead and drop them in there. One thing that maybe Christy, you could talk about is, how does access to the digital archives change the way that library users can do their work? Could you maybe address that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. I was just making sure I'm off mute. Yeah, well, I think as Angela was giving some great examples and talking really about both the editorial process, but also from a user perspective. So in conclusion, we are aware that having access both to contemporary, but also archival research does make a researcher or a student or even a faculty member their work a lot easier, as they can access digital archives remotely. I think obviously this year is an exceptional year out of because of the pandemic globally, but as Angela mentioned in her early research career, going to the library, going to the stacks, and retrieving the actual physical book. But the Nature Archives collection is fully digitized, so users can access it remotely. They no longer need to travel to search the archives manually. And just an emphasis really on the, like, for example, the access to good high resolution scans right from their desks. Without digitization of the archives, they previously may have had to wait or travel, but I think this year is really a very significant circumstances with people researching and learning from distance-wise from the university. So yeah, I think it's certainly in past having access from any type of device at any time has really shaped the way that researchers research, giving them a lot of freedom.
Definitely, yeah. And thinking about just the times in which we're all sort of living right now, you had mentioned, Angela, that there's been a marked uptick in the number of submissions. And I just wonder if that has impacted, or how that has impacted sort of your editorial processes. Have you had to bring more people on, or is it, has it meant you've had to streamline things, or what has that just rapid increase meant?
Well, it completely overwhelmed our virology editor, it has to be said. So starting in January, when, for example, we received the first paper reporting the sequence of the virus itself, which we published, sort of almost immediately, she was completely overwhelmed. And, I think she tried to handle it for the first month by herself. And then it really became clear that, help was needed. And so other members of the editorial staff started helping her. So a paper that was more about sort of the RNA polymerase of the virus that normally she would have handled went to the molecular biology editor who handles transcription. Papers that were about, vaccines and antibody therapies would go to the immunology editor. Clinical trials went to our clinical editor. So, we had to divide and conquer, but even so, she still has a workload that's, quite scary. So we don't know how long this is going to go on for. We still see so many papers being submitted on coronavirus. But, we basically, everybody is pitching in and helping, except maybe, the paleontology and ecology editors.
And even they might get roped in. No.
I don't know if she would want that.
Certainly. Excellent. So I'm just thinking through here. With I had one other thing there, but it's completely gone. So looking through the questions, I would just say to folks, we have a couple of minutes, but if you do have other questions, okay, this is something interesting. As I say, that came in from Deirdre again. So thank you, Deirdre. And maybe this is something that, Angela, you can talk about a little bit. And I suspect that there may or may, so I'll just put the question to you. What is the connection, if any, between Nature and preprint servers? Do you find papers, do you go out as an editor and look for papers on the preprints? So
certainly some of my colleagues who are, active on social media, are sort of scanning preprint servers. Personally, I don't do it myself. But, there are members of the team who are sort of looking out for things that they think might be interesting. And if they see something, they'll, let the appropriate editor know. We do require that all of the coronavirus papers must be submitted to the WHO and to a preprint server sort of from the time of submission. So basically, there is no lag in terms of the papers being out there and available to the public. And so that's something that, is, really why you're seeing in the news a lot of stories about papers that are not yet peer reviewed. It's actually because it is a requirement. So that information can be exchanged, as immediately as possible. We have no problems with people posting their papers to preprint servers. You know, a lot of people, not coronavirus related research, do it before they, or while their paper is being peer reviewed. We don't have any problem with that. You know, our only restriction is that at the time that the paper, should it be accepted, the authors are not allowed to update sort of the preprint with like the final version. So all we allow is that authors can post the sort of initial submitted version.
Excellent. Yeah, that's very interesting. So one thing that just in your presentation you talked about that sort of blew my mind, and maybe you could clarify this. I think you had said between 150 and 180 submissions come in each week. Is that just in the areas that you cover, or is that for all of nature? I was going to say that. I was like,
that's biology.
Okay.
So this year it's actually up in the 200s most week. You know,
Okay.
even I was looking over the statistics last night, and I think a couple of weeks we hit like 270-ish submissions. So we have 18 biology editors. So,
okay.
You know, on average, you know, you're seeing maybe 8 to 10 papers a week, although it varies by discipline. So, for example, we have only one ecology editor, and there's actually a lot happening in that area. So her load tends to be higher than some others. So it's not equally distributed. It really is on the basis of the subject matter that the papers are assigned to an editor.
Interesting. Yeah. So that's within the biology area, but that certainly is not the only thing Nature is covering. So the total number of submissions is far, far higher.
Right. So physical sciences receives fewer submissions than biology. So that's why we have a slightly larger team on the biological sciences side. But actually they're picking up, and, you know, their papers can be super impactful. So I think last year, like material science, just like so many citations to papers on material science last year from physics.
Excellent. Interesting. Yeah. All right. So looking through the questions, I'm not seeing a whole bunch of others coming through. So I'll go ahead and just say thank you, Angela, so much for taking the time to put together this presentation and to explain sort of the behind the scenes of how things work at Nature, and for taking the time to answer the questions that have come in. And I would say thank you, Christy, for stepping in and presenting on the archives. There's a lot of really interesting stuff in there. And I would just say to you out there listening in, thank you for taking the time today to join us. We hope to see you on another webinar in the near future. And as you sign out, if you could take a second and just respond to the brief survey that we have at the end there. We'd really appreciate any feedback that you have. So thank you very much for your time today, and we hope to see you soon.
And Mark, if I could just add in for those that are still on the line, you can expect to receive the webinar recording and any of the questions that we might have not gotten to, or any of the resources that were asked about, I'll share with all of you so that you have those. So,
excellent.
Thanks again for joining us.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.